Today we're going to draw these beautiful little shells from the tropics. The first thing I do is draw roughly around each shell in pencil and then pick out the shape a little bit more accurately in pen. Adding a little bit of paint when the ink is dry, little stripes down the way, little soft nice pink. Being careful to respect the highlight, so there's a bit down the middle that's going to be left completely white. Add a little bit of warm yellow into the bottom of the shell while the paint is still wet, so it blends nicely with the pink around the edge and at the top. Darkening up the pink a little bit just to give it a bit of emphasis. Again, being careful not to kill that white strip down the side where the shine is. And on to the second one, and I'm not bothering to rub out the pencil lines, and whoops, drawn the ellipse very badly. So I tried to correct it by making the other side of it a little bit deeper, but it's still not quite right. Never mind, I can fix it in a minute. It's drawing the edge of the little opening of the shell. And then I change my mind and draw the thick bit of it on the inside of that flap. Just emphasising the other side more accurately. It doesn't matter if you don't draw exactly on your line. And I'm just adding those little colourful little spots at the top, and you can probably just about make out the white gel pen on the right there, where I got rid of the wrong line of the ellipse and then waited for the white gel pen to dry and then fixed it with my brown ink. So my Rosemary R13 brush is great for this job because it does have a nice little point. You need to be delicate enough here. I'm using a mixture of burnt sienna and burnt umber. I can always come back and make them a little bit darker, but the important thing right now is just to get them in the right place. I must paint a little bit gently over that white gel pen. I don't want it to lift. Always a little bit nervous going over an area I've painted, but generally it works quite well. Time to add the dark shadow in the opening. Make sure my edges are really accurately done and make sure I don't go over the edge of the shell, because I will destroy the illusion of shadow if I don't give it a nice sharp edge. Same on the first shell I've done. And the colour I'm using is deep sea black mixed with a little burnt umber. So the deep sea black is a fabulous super granulating colour by Schmincke, and it's just really versatile. Oh, now for those spots. They looked so adorable on the shell, but I wasn't so sure if I'd be able to get the feeling right. So I was very careful to try and get the spots in the right places. One thing I did miss, however, was that not alone do they follow these little curves, but they also follow strips down the, let's say, the pointy long axis of the shell. Again, I can make them a little bit darker once they're dry, but the important thing is to try and get them in the right places for now. Time to add a little bit of shadow just underneath the pointy bit at the top of the shell on the flat side. I noticed a small little line of slight shadow going down the centre of the shell, which is what I'm doing there. On to the next one, roughly drawing around it. Now the pencil line, as I say, I don't bother getting rid of it, but it's not really the shape of the shell. It's just a really good way to get the position and the size. And then you can have a good look at the shell and draw it a little bit more accurately with your ink. And then I added those bright orange spots. I found them a little bit tricky. Again, I figured I could darken them up a little bit as I went on. Drawing round the fourth shell. Holding it as steady as I can with my finger. So it doesn't look like much when you've done your little pencil outline. But then it's up to you to look carefully at your shell and make it bigger or change the shape as you see fit. So as you can see, look at this. Really didn't follow the pencil line that I did very much at all. I'm being a bit careful with my ellipse after my experience with the first shell. Then I made some nice pinky colour and I painted in the pretty little patterns on the shell. And I deepened them up wherever I saw that I needed to do that. It's probably a mixture of Aquarius red and magenta, but everybody has their own shade of dark pinky red. But do make sure you have a nice hot pink in your palette as well, because it does come in very handy. Darkening up the inside of the shell a little bit, sort of a warm light brown. Doing the same colour on the shell to the left. Next one, big cowrie. Now this one, I made a big mistake with the edge and I saw that I had immediately. So I fixed it. I widened the shell a little bit and I figured I could come back to it and darken up the brown. So this one was a little trickier. It had lots of knobbly bits up and down the sides. I do like drawing the insides of the shell, the undersides, those little lines, the way they come together. It seems to look good when you've done it, and it's actually not that hard at all. I thought I made this shell a little bit on the skinny side, but in the end it looked okay. Little knobbly bits up and down the outside and around the shell. You can see I'm using the skinny side of my Fude nib to get the finer details. So time to paint the cowrie shell. And I decided that the spots weren't very white. They were more of a, I suppose, a glassy bluey white. However, the highlights were really strong. They were super, super bright. So it was important that I, let's say, safety ring off these little areas so that my brush wouldn't stray onto them by accident. And I immediately soften those little paint marks I made, because if I don't, I'll end up with these hard lines and that won't look believable. So I'm just pulling out that brown paint into the surrounding area. Underside of this one, nice very pale purpley blue, deep sea violet getting mixed with a bit of blue for that. Getting a little bit darker, a little bit of glacier brown, super granulating colour by Schmincke. And a similar colour but a bit more dilute for the outside edges of the shell. Really putting my observational powers to good use, given my eyes a good workout, I suppose. So letting shells dry while I go back to the first one, and I'm using my brown ink to add definition to the little patterns. And in a fit of impatience, I decided to fill in the inside of the shell with dark brown ink, but then I realised that wasn't really the look I went for. So quickly, before the ink had a chance to dry, I just put some clean water on top and let the ink just wash through. Deepen it up a little bit. Letting it be a little bit bluer at the bottom. Now it's time to add the shadows. Some lovely deep sea violet shadows, the super granulating colour by Schmincke. You can use it strong or you can use it dilute, but either way it'll dry to a lovely granulated texture. So I'm looking for a way to darken up the patterns here, and I've used a burnt umber mixed with a tiny bit of Payne's grey. Oh, just to point out, the paints I'm using are by Roman Schmal for the most part. I have one colour of Daniel Smith in my palette, but I'm not using it today. That's Green Apatite Genuine. So here is burnt umber mixed with a little bit of Payne's grey, both by Roman Schmal. But I was delighted to have the deep sea violet and the deep sea black, the super granulating colours by Schmincke, especially for the shadows on the insides of shells. Looking for really dark bits that I can drop in while the paint is still wet. Because if you do that, if you drop it in while it's still wet, it'll just smoothly blush in, which is really nice. Look at that, keeping the highlight, the strip of the highlight down the shell. So a highlight just doesn't have any colour on it at all. And it's those little highlights that suddenly make your work look very realistic. Making the shadow a bit richer by adding the one on the other side, on the other shell, and the overlap always looks really good. And that's because I have two lights shining on the shells from two different directions. Just adding some details here, darkening up those little brown patterns, making sure that the paint all around it is completely dry, otherwise the paint will run and you'll get fuzzy edges and you won't get sharp edges and it won't look right. I'm really just finessing details at this stage. I've got all my shapes, I've got my broad areas of colour. So my job from here on in is to darken up colours, deepen them, add shadows, deepen up the insides, anything that needs doing. So once again, I've got a shadow coming out on both sides of the shell because of the light direction. You might notice a little white gap between the left-hand edge of the shell and the shadow. Oh, I'm just closing it up. That's because the brown was still a bit wet and I didn't want to risk a colour run. Some delicate little details. Time to add more shadows, building up little bits of colour that I might have left a little bit too light. And really just looking in really, really well, glancing back at my subject all the time to make sure that I've got the right amount of intensity to the colour, dots in the right place, trying for the overall look, including the little dark patches as well on the first shell, to darken them up too, to get that good sense of richness. So at this stage, it's really about tweaking. You'll get a much darker and more dramatic effect if you wait for the first layer to dry before you add another one. So that's what I've done here. These first patches of brown are very dry. And as you can see, that lets me do nice, sharp details. Okay, so this one, it didn't go as well for me as the others. The orange was pretty accurate, I think, and the shadows were okay. But I did try a few times to get that orange colour for those little flecks, and I wasn't 100% sure that they were coming out well. So as a result, I was kind of messing with them and adding bits more of orange. And then I found myself losing patience in terms of time. And I didn't really wait long enough for the orange and the little bits of dark inside the shell to dry before adding my shadow. And as a result, my shadow and my shell started to run into each other. It wasn't too bad at this point, but just wait for it because it does get worse. Uh-oh. I didn't even pick it up at this stage that I was about to get a massive colour run. And I'm going a bit too close for comfort to the edge of that shell. A little bit added at the bottom. Now, one thing you have to do at the shadow's edge is decide whether it has a sharp edge or a soft edge. And if you want, in this case, the edges were quite soft. And if you want that soft edge, what you do is you clean your brush, get rid of all the shadow colour, and then wipe your brush a load of times on the edge of your water pot and run it over the border, and that'll soften it up nicely. Just make sure you do it before the paint is dry, or you won't get the effect. So deepening up that orange. Going very close to that shadow. Whoops. You can see the orange has gone running into the shadow. It's not the effect I want. If you want the shadow to look realistic, you really need to have it separate to the shadow, to whatever's causing it to throw the shadow. So at this stage, again, I cleaned the brush, and with a clean damp brush, I tried to lift those orangey bits. They'd kind of been hanging around too long to lift properly. If you do it when the paint is completely fresh and wet, you have a chance. But the orange kept flooding into the shadow. Every time I tried to lift it off, in went more orangey bits. In the end, I just had to decide, okay, knock it on the head, give it up, and come back when the orange is completely dry. So I went on to the next little shell beside it. I'm using Deep Sea Violet by Schmincke because it really makes a fabulous shadow colour. Love that colour. It's really, really nice. And the other side, because as I mentioned earlier, I have two light sources, so the shadow's been thrown on both sides. Darkening up a little bit inside the little entrance. Good bit of dark there, just to really show that it's gloomy. Back to my cowrie shell and filling in the browns around the outsides of the little spots. I'm using a mixture of Glacier Brown, the super granulating colour by Schmincke, as well as, I suppose, various little bits of brown that I have in my palette and the lid. Burnt umber, maybe a little bit of burnt sienna. And it's important to keep those little white spots. So I'm painstakingly going around them, which is a little bit tedious. But then again, once you get into it, you don't really notice so much. Those highlights are really only allowed to shine and sparkle by having a dark and very sharp edge around them. So those are the highlights of where the light is hitting the very glossy cowrie shell. Getting on with shadows. More Deep Sea Violet by Schmincke. Softening the edges because it is quite a fuzzy little edge. So working my way through some of the other shadows, the one around the cowrie shell. Trying, hopefully, to have learnt my lesson and wait for the brown colour to dry before I add the rest of the shadow. Same for the one around the little knobbly shell. Deepening up inside the shell a little bit. If you paint on top of an overlap, you don't even have to darken the colour. It'll darken naturally just by virtue of there being more than one layer. Little streak of shadowy colour down that shell. And again, another little bit of overlap. Carefully picked out with the point of the brush. These are the little details that make all the difference. And it really is just a question of looking hard, using your eyes. And here we go. I'm trying to put up a little part of a deeper shadow. And this time the orange is all dried. So hopefully I'll be able to make it up. Another shadow on the cowrie shell. So look carefully at your shadows and ask yourself, which one is darker? And does it get darker towards the subject that's casting the shadow? This is my attempt at trying to add a bit of definition to the little knobbly bits. Just adding a little bit of shadow on the upper edges of all those little sticky out bits. A little bit of shadow colour on the underside of the shell and on the sides of it as well. Deepening up the inside of the shell. It's important. I'm putting a little bit of speed on here to get through it. Darkening up the little marks. Little dark brown marks in the shell. On the inside, giving a little bit more of a layer. And this is a bit of a, not exactly a cheat. I used my shocking pink fuchsia coloured atramentis document ink. And I used that here for the little marks on the shells because I felt I wasn't getting the right amount of definition by using my brush. I even went over the little splashes of pink on the underside of the shell as well. Been very careful to only put the marks where the paint is dried. Otherwise I'd have large colour runs of a whole different magnitude if it's pink ink running everywhere. Catching that spirally look with all those little flecks. It's nice to really look into an object like this and just ask yourself, well, what is going on? Adding a little bit more depth around the spots in the cowrie shell. As you can see, I've managed to hide that wrong edge that I did earlier. Asking myself, looking at my shell and asking myself, well, do those darker bits of brown have a soft edge or a sharp edge? In this case, they were sort of soft. And then just for the finishing touches, I add a little bit of pencil to smudge up and darken up some of those little dark patches. And you can also use the pencil as a sort of a shading tool. Now, a little word of warning. When you're using your pencil, make sure to do the softest of strokes that all build up together to make a nice flat grey area. You don't want to see the back and forth scribbly lines of the pencil. So this is a 4B pencil, which is lovely and soft. And it's terrific for shading. I'm even using it on the cowrie shell as well. Don't use pencil much. I certainly don't use it for drawing unless I'm just doing a rough. But it is very useful for this kind of shading. And the white gel pen just to finish off those little spots. Now, the white gel pen isn't as bright as the highlights, but it's still really, really useful for making those little white spots. And the cowrie shell did actually have different colour spots. Some were the very light blue colour, some were very, very light golden. Some of them were a little bit more on the white side. A little bit more pencil work to help make those knobbly bits stand out. Little bits of white, little bits of pencil, just absolute finishing touches. And there we go. That is it. That is the end of my little sketch. And I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you got something out of that. I hope you picked up some tips about patience and about drawing and about enjoying yourself. So I look forward to seeing you next time.